Giver of many gifts, thank you for the opportunity to be together as your people this day, to celebrate community, to share a meal that reminds us of your nourishment and presence in our life. We ask now that you will open our hearts and our minds for a word, for a lesson, for an insight this day. Amen. Writer Frederick Buechner wrote of a small but very meaningful experience in one of his memoirs. He says, sick with anxiety, depressed, doom-ridden, I was parked in front of the Peltier's market in Dorset, Vermont. Does anybody know that market? Peltier Market? It was on Route 30, and I could see this car coming down the road. And it had a license plate on it that I could see. And as I saw this license plate for the first time that now hangs on my wall, I could see it said trust. Trust. It said the one word I needed to hear. And Buechner wrote about that moment at that time, and several years later, a stranger who read the writing about that license plate showed up at his door and gave him the license plate and said, this must be the license plate that you're talking about, it, recognizing that it was his license plate in the story. Now that license plate by this time was in not such great shape. It had crumpled edges. The metal was bent, it was rusted, and the registration, you almost couldn't see the registration tag. Can you just picture that road worn, fly spotted, dented, bug-covered license plate with the word trust written on it? We have all had moments when trust has been as elusive to us as it is imperative. We can feel that courage takes trust. We kind of know that to have courage, we have to have trust. And trust is one of the first things we're told we learn. Eric Erickson, the psychologist, who talked about developmental cycles, and he said the first thing we learn as little wee babies is that notion of trust. We're so completely helpless, just kind of sitting there, and you have all these big people around you, and you learn at that point something about trust and developing a sense of whether or not the adults around us are trustworthy. And that kind of informs our development. And beyond this basic, even unconscious sense of whether we trust, whether the world can be trusted, beyond that, trust becomes a choice, doesn't it? We don't really have a choice when we're wee ones. We're just kind of learning whether life is trustworthy and the world is trustworthy. But at some point, trust becomes a choice. And it's a choice that we make repeatedly, time and time and time again in life. It's not automatic, and it shouldn't be automatic. The first verse in John that Heidi just read for us kind of tees up this idea pretty clearly. It says, my dear friend, don't believe everything you hear. Carefully weigh and examine what people tell you. There are a lot of lying preachers loose in the world. Amen. It's true. The advice to be of the church comes at a time when they're trying to sort out what God means to them, what God would have for them in this community, and who are the sheep that are in wolves' clothing, or wolves that are in sheep's clothing. Yeah, that's how it goes. There are times when it is not good to trust. Yet we must trust. Trust is like a growth hormone of positive relationships. It's legal. It won't get you banned from the Olympics. Trust is like a growth hormone in the spirit. Do you guys remember the Olympics are happening? Okay. Just checking. They seem to be kind of flying underneath the radar this year with all the other excitement in our lives and in the news. It's that thing, that dynamic that creates life-giving moments, plans, possibilities. They thrive in that soil of trust. So we have the story of Naomi and Ruth. Naomi was Ruth's mother-in-law, and it was a tragic time, and Naomi was heartbroken. Years before, there was famine in her land, so she and her husband and her boys had to move to Moab to get out of the place of famine. And eventually, her sons both took wives, and those wives would be Ruth and Orpah. So you have Naomi with her sons and her daughter-in-law, and within 10 years of moving to Moab to escape famine, her husband dies and both of her sons die. It's a tragic time. And she is there with Ruth, and she is there with Orpah. And according to social customs, she could have required her daughter-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, to go with her, because she needed to go back to where she came from. The only place she had living relatives, she needed to go back to that place. And she could require these two women to come with her because, you have a greater chance of survival when you have a little extra, a little bigger group, a little bigger community. But instead of requiring them to travel back to a land that they know nothing about, she releases them to return to their homeland. She hoped that they could find family left in Moab who would take care of them and help them have a life that would be filled in some way after the loss of the husbands that they had. But Ruth was an odd one. She'd come to love, to trust Naomi. She didn't want to leave her mother-in-law's fate to the unknown, to chance. And, it's not like she gets legalistic with her mother-in-law Naomi and says, well, the law says that you should take me with you, and, she just says with a heart full of love and trust and faith that she wants and promises to join Naomi's culture, her people, her faith, till death do they part. That was a very interesting choice that Ruth made. And Naomi had offered her freedom as an act of loving kindness to her daughter-in-law. And as an act of loving kindness, Ruth, in turn, decided to stay with Naomi and travel to Bethlehem. Ruth says what is a fairly famous quote from our Hebrew Scriptures: "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." And so they returned to Bethlehem, where they gleaned the fields to survive. Do you know what gleaning the fields is? I did some field gleaning when I was growing up. in some of the rougher times, we'd take all of us 4 rugrats to a field that had already been picked over and harvested. And you could go there after they've been done and gather up boxes of produce that for dimes on the dollar and take them home and eat it. And in that day, they allowed people to come who had no food and no money to glean the field so they could survive. So there was Naomi and Ruth gleaning the fields in their homeland of Bethlehem. And Ruth happened to wander on to a field of Boaz. And Boaz happened to be a member of Naomi's extended family. Are you guys remembering this story from Sunday school? Some of you, yeah? Now, Boaz had heard about Ruth's faithfulness, and he was kind of intrigued by the idea that although she had a chance to stay at home and go back to her family, she made a covenant, a promise to Naomi. So Boaz arranges for at first their protection and their provision. For Naomi and Ruth, he does that by telling this guy, you know, they're going to be at this field, so just leave a little extra there. Don't clean that field. Leave a few of the very ripe produce so they can have something to eat. So, imagine it was what? Olives and what else, Chuck? We just had this in our class.
Anything you want.
Anything you want? So he says, you know, to them to leave extra so my family and her daughter-in-law can eat. And eventually, we know what happens, most of us. She, meaning Ruth, and Boaz, through this ongoing relationship of trust that started way back in Moab, ended up trusting one another, loving one another, and getting married. And then Ruth eventually gives birth to a child who will be the ancestor of David, the king, and Jesus. It's a pretty good story. I studied the topic Fearless Faith, Courage in Community, during my study week at Insidson Campground while I was gone. It's a UCC campground in Idaho. The very first day of the study, the topic was Courage to Trust in Community. Courage to Trust in Community. Ruth was at a crucial spot, wasn't she, in her life, in her community life. There was a big fork in the road. She had a clear choice in front of her. One path was this opportunity that she didn't expect to have, an opportunity that her sister-in-law took without thinking about it hardly, right? Took this path. It was probably the easiest path to go back to family. They're just down the road. But Ruth is standing at this fork in the road, and I can imagine Ruth waving goodbye to her sister-in-law, Orpah, as she headed home. Imagine what it would be like herself to head home to those she knew and loved. I can imagine Ruth standing at the crossroad, discerning, praying. She had faith in God. And she needed the courage to trust this decision. First, she had to trust God. Then who did she have to trust? Herself. She had to trust herself to make the right decision with the Spirit's guidance. I'm going to go home or I'm going to go to a strange land. Then she had to trust her community. And at that time, her community was very small. It was her mother-in-law. It seems that the trust in oneself and the trust in community are so often intertwined. They're supposed to be intertwined. It took courage for Ruth to trust her decision to go to a strange land where she was going to be what? A foreigner, a widow, a nobody. She was going to be completely vulnerable over here in this who knows what place she was going to. It took courage to go with the woman she knew and loved and cared for, her mother-in-law. And I think courage can really grow as trust deepens. Courage can grow as trust deepens. So if you're thinking about a community that you're a part of, and you want it to be one of courage, you want it to be one where people learn to trust one another, you have to step in. You have to take some risks if you want to go from a group of people to a trusting community. And we can get so complacent, we can get so lazy, we can get so whatever your thing is, that it's hard to do that. It's hard to take the time. It's not always easy to build community because it does take time, it does take energy. You do have to end up sometimes showing up somewhere when you'd rather stay home watching NCIS reruns on Netflix for the fourth time. We have fears of being in community. We'll be needed too much. We won't be liked. We won't be needed at all. But like, community is like sort of tending that garden. It takes time and energy. And I know some of you are tending some really big gardens this year. And it takes time and energy. But the fruit, you can trust that the fruit of your labor will be apparent. How many of you know Anne Lamott? She's an amazing writer. She writes some sort of the salty, sort of, I would call it lowbrow spirituality, but really accessible, not pretentious stories of her spiritual journey. And she writes persuasively about her own experience with her church, being drawn into this community little by little, learning to, getting the courage up. She started by standing at the door, and then she was lured in, over the time she attended with the sound of the gospel music, right? And then after she deepened her relationship with Jesus and found some recovery, she began to trust and get courage to trust the people at the church more. And then she started becoming instrumental in the church's life. The courage came from developing trust with the people at that little church. And if you read her books, you can find how transformational this tiny little church in Northern California was to her, and probably hundreds and thousands of people beyond her through her writing. And she wrote a book, she has a son, and she has to decide, how many of you know that your high schoolers and your junior highers are going to get up and want to come to church Sunday morning, right? Probably wasn't true when you had them, and it's probably not true for those of you who have youngins now. Sometimes they just want to stay in bed. Sometimes they could just spend Sunday morning going through Facebook or whatever it might be that brings them, sort of rest and comfort on the weekends. But she makes her teenage son go to church. He's grown now. And she made him go even though he hated it. And she wrote this, "Why do I make him go? Because I want him to. Because we live in a bewildering, drastic time. And a little spiritual guidance never killed anyone. I want him to see the people who loved me when I felt most unlovable. Who loved him since I first told them that he was growing in my womb. Even though he might not want to be with them, I want him to see their faces. I know there's nourishment for him at church. There is real teaching, and a prime parental role is to insist that your kids get real teaching. I'm always amazed when people say, oh, we're too busy to come to church, and they think they get food, they get school, they get all these parts of their holistic system fixed and fed, but somehow the spiritual life doesn't get on the list of things that people need teaching about. Showing up is a lesson, she says. The singing is a lesson. And the power of community is a lesson. I can't get this to him in a nice little package like a toaster, pastry, or takeout. So every 2 weeks, I make him come to church with me. For some of us, Sundays mornings is still like that, right? We've been at work all week, or, we had a long conversation with someone the night before, and we forget that church and coming to church is an act of community and an act of learning. And I'm glad that Anne invoked the toaster pastry, reminding us that human beings, particularly maybe our culture, wrongly crave things that are prepackaged, sweet, swift, and easy. Community is not like that. You might have figured that out by now. I figured it out. Community is not like an easy open toaster pastry. Love is not like that. Loving, trusting community takes time and care to nurture. The story of Naomi and Ruth is so powerful, and it also has a happy ending. But our courage to trust isn't always going to look that way. It sometimes will look like a beat-up old license plate, as will our lives at times. Courage doesn't always end up with everything perfect. It can be that beloved old license plate that's been bent and torn and smashed into by a bunch of bugs. But courage to live well-placed trust. Courage to live well-placed trust, even after the nicks and the scratches, can manifest enduring and fiercely beautiful relationships in transformative communities of faith. May it be so. Amen.
Amen.